Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. So, this episode, we're going to discuss the July report, Nuclear Security Index 2023 by Nuclear Threat Initiative. Now, NTI describes itself as a non-profit, non-partisan global security organization focused on reducing nuclear and biological threats imperiling humanity. Now, those are very strong and actually scary words. The 2023 NTI Index assesses the security of some of the world's most dangerous materials, highly enriched uranium and plutonium, against theft and the security of nuclear facilities against acts of sabotage. Now, this is the sixth iteration. There have been 5 previous reports by NTI. So, stolen HEU of plutonium could be used to build a nuclear bomb. Sabotage of a nuclear facility could result in a dangerous release of radiation. Developed in partnership with Economist Impact and informed by an international panel of respected nuclear security experts, the report tracks country and area level progress on nuclear security and recommends actions for governments to protect nuclear materials and facilities and to strengthen the global nuclear security architecture. The report also assigns rankings from 0 to 100, 100 being tops the line. To discuss the report and why it is titled Falling Short in a Dangerous World, let me bring in and introduce the panel. I'm joined by Scott Roecker, Vice President, Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Materials Security Program. Roecker has had a long career dealing with nuclear-related issues and materials. With him is Sitara Noor, currently an associate at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She just returned from there. Noor was also on the panel of experts during the compiling of this report. And my third guest is Dr. Adil Sultan. He's a former Air Commodore in Pakistan Air Force. Dr. Sultan is Dean, Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies at Air University. He also served at the Strategic Plans Division for 14 years and was Director, Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at SPD. These are very short bios, frankly. I mean, all 3 experts have very long bios. And if I were to go through their bios at length, we'd probably spend another 30 minutes doing that. But welcome to all 3 of you. Scott, let me begin with you. And the obvious question, because a lot of our viewers are informed generalists, they're not experts on the nuclear side. So a word about the NTI, its work, and this 6th iteration, the report. How is it compiled and what goes into it?
Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I work for the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization located in Washington, D.C. It was established a little more than 20 years ago in 2001. And we're a little bit different than the kind of standard NGO, non-government organization in DC. We really focus on trying to achieve systematic change. And we have a very specific process that we follow to do that. We look for actionable solutions that countries can take on board to improve nuclear security, biological security. We then engage across the globe to make sure that these solutions are viable. We demonstrate that they work, and then ultimately turn that over to governments to make the progress that is required to improve nuclear security. And that's really kind of the idea of the Nuclear Security Index. This was something that began in 2012 during the Nuclear Security Summit process, and was a ranking that we did every 2 years. So we did it in 2014, 2016, really following that Nuclear Security Summit process that was launched by the United States by President Obama. And it was really, the idea was, let's see how things are looking on nuclear security and identify, again, ways that countries can improve. And so we were seeing very good progress on nuclear security through that Nuclear Security Summit process. The index in 2018, we saw that things were starting to stagnate a little bit in terms of progress, saw the same thing in 2020. But what we're seeing in 2023 is of very significant concern. We're actually seeing backsliding. We're seeing scores going down in those countries that have highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium, as you noted at the top. We're seeing the scores go down in countries that have nuclear facilities as well. And so this is a very alarming trend that we're seeing, and we're really concerned about the progress and the direction of nuclear security worldwide.
Thank you, Scott. That was a great introduction to the work. And we're going to return to, as I said, why the report is titled Falling Short, and what are the new threats and dangers and what kind of opportunities we can have. But let me pull in Adil Sultan here, because both as a scholar and also as a practitioner, representing Pakistan at various forums, official also, bilateral, multilateral. So Adil, why was this significant, or why is this significant, this index? And when you were there as a practitioner, was it something that was helpful? Was it something that for which officially you would provide some information to NTI? What was the process?
Once this process started in 2009 by the Obama initiative of Nuclear Security Summit, it was mainly intended to bring in states to encourage them to take nuclear security responsibly and more seriously. The countries at that time were a little wary about the NGOs' involvement in this kind of a process. And that's why they had been reluctant in sharing information with the NTI or any other NGO which does this kind of work. But over past several years, what we have seen, the objective assessment done by the NTI, because they don't raise fingers, they don't point fingers towards countries, and they don't hold them accountable. So they just provide this kind of statistics for which countries they can choose and pick and whatever suits them and help improve nuclear security. Over a period of time, we have seen comfort developing in some countries, although some countries like Pakistan still does not share officially. And that is because of the sensitivities also about the nuclear weapons and the military side of the thing. But mostly about the civilian application, since the data is collected from the open sources, whatever available. And there are experts. This time also, probably there was an expert, Pakistani expert, who could validate the data also. I think that's how it started, and that's how it is moving or making a progress. And from a Pakistani perspective, I think the way it has projected these threats or threat scenarios and informed the country or by the international community what are the real dangers or possible dangers for the future, and what are the weak areas, weak links in each country's nuclear security architecture. I think that's something that's appreciable also, and that's how the countries are now feeling more comfortable. If not officially, they are sharing some information informally through experts or through other sources.
Right. Sitara, in fact, Sitara was on the panel of experts, international panel of experts, not specifically focusing on Pakistan, but because she's a Pakistani, so she was the Pakistani expert on that international panel. So Sitara, Adil has talked about sensitivities, and obviously we know, I mean, all, especially the nuclear weapon states, have those sensitivities. But it seems to me, as someone who's been looking at nuclear-related issues for a very long time myself, that regardless, it's actually important to look at best practices. And I think there was a time when the United States officially, I'll actually get back to Adil on that. United States actually officially helped Pakistan develop some of those best practices, and then the entire thing evolved and we developed our own practices also, the rest of it. So give us a sense of the process which you were a part of and why it's important for the countries overall to actually take these challenges and threats very seriously, not just because NTI is telling them, but simply because it's something that, I can give you the example, for instance, of the accidental launch of a hypersonic cruise missile from India into the Pakistani airspace, and it crashed in Punjab, not very far from where you and I are sitting actually. And so there are so many things that need to be worked at and on. So give us a sense of the process and why you think it's significant.
Thank you, Ejaz. I think you have asked a very important question, particularly with regards to the process and countries, how countries look at it, the countries under question look at it. And I would refer back to, if you look at some of the official statements or official documents that have come out from the IISS platform or some of the international agreements, the first thing that you would notice is that countries emphasize that nuclear security is a national responsibility. So this is something countries have restricted international scrutiny to a greater extent, or accountability for that matter. And this is where countries take responsibility on their own, but there is no check as such as to what countries are doing, because they essentially guard it as national responsibility. And now, if the other part of it is like, what are the legal obligations there? So right now, it's only the International Convention for Physical Protection of nuclear material and facilities. And its ambit is really broad, but it's still not sufficient in terms of when it comes to explaining as to what countries are doing and what actions they have undertaken at the national level. So this is where reports like these become important. And even though countries do not officially acknowledge that they are officially sharing certain information, countries now have started understanding that there is value in sharing some information, even unofficially. And I think this is one element where Pakistan ranking has also improved over the years significantly, because earlier on, because of some of the different reluctances, which Adil also referred as to, because Pakistan being a nuclear weapon state has its peculiar concerns with regards to what they are talking about and what concerns it might have. But it is always important to share what are the good things that countries have done. And I think countries like Pakistan and many others, and this is, I think, one element that I highlighted as well during the process of discussion, that NGOs like NTI should encourage countries to share some of the activities that they're doing, but they're not sharing at any international platform. If you look at Pakistan's example, for instance, since I was part of the Nuclear Regulatory Authority, where I was part of the nuclear security, the group that was looking at the Nuclear Security Action Plan project. So I also know that there were a number of things that Pakistan was doing, but it was not acknowledged internationally, because we tend to, just don't talk about it.
So, sorry, just a clarification. Was that because Pakistan was not sharing that information about the things that it was doing?
No, I mean, that was morely on the civilian side. So most of the information was there, but there was an information gap, which I think did existed. For instance, for example, if you look at the regulation on nuclear security, it was a draft regulation, and it was something Pakistan had adopted, that being without being passed, officially become part of its nuclear regulatory authority. But this was something Pakistan was not telling. But when the regulation was passed eventually and became part of the system officially, then it improved Pakistan's ranking significantly. So these are the things where countries, and now if you attach value, that there is some value in having those regulations and having those best practices. So countries start attaching more importance to not just have them, but also tell the rest of the world that this is what we have achieved so far. This process started with the Nuclear Security Summit process, because this has actually brought out the normative value of nuclear security as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Scott, here's the thing. With 9/11, even before 9/11, but certainly after 9/11, there were lots of films and television series and analyses and the rest of it about the terrorists getting their hands on some kind of chem bioweapons or an improvised nuclear device or RDD and the rest of it. But that has not happened, mercifully, for a number of reasons, and we can discuss those. But what we have actually seen in terms of a real problem or a potential problem is a big power going to war with another state, and where you have, for instance, now the north-south axis is gone, but first we had the problem with Chernobyl. Now there was the problem with Zaporizhia's nuclear plant. Is this something, and what we have witnessed, is this something that's a real danger in terms of, I mean, if artillery shelling or rocketing or cruise missiles destroy the plant, the radiation goes out, how does one deal with that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think it's important to say up front that certainly the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing in the world today doesn't diminish the threat of a non-state actor or a terrorist getting an improvised nuclear device. The most difficult step in that process is acquiring highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium. Fortunately, that's not material you can just dig up in the ground. It requires quite a significant infrastructure to get that material. We know that there's some material sort of outside of regulatory control, so we know that it's on the black market. It is possible to get. And I'm concerned that the world is paying less attention to this because of what we're seeing in it playing out right now in Ukraine. And you mentioned the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in particular. That's a very concerning situation where we could see a significant release of radiation at any moment if one of those 6 reactors were hit by a missile or some other military action. And that is really kind of changing how we're thinking about nuclear security, seeing a state actor doing these kinds of actions. And we can really draw on the lessons learned from what happened in Fukushima, how we operated nuclear facilities during the pandemic. There have been more, difficult, environments in which to operate nuclear facilities. And so we're going to be focusing a lot of attention on this issue to try and identify ways that we can strengthen the legal framework and the normative framework around reactors in times of crisis, whether that be a war, whether that be, some extreme weather. And, actually one of the most best examples we have comes from South Asia. And this is something we've been talking a lot about. The 1989 agreement between India and Pakistan not to attack each other's nuclear facilities, which is renewed on an annual basis with providing coordinates for the facilities that are going to be protected. Essentially, these are do not attack areas. We would love to see this replicated in other parts of the globe as well, as we see an expected expansion of nuclear energy to new countries.
Right. That's a very important point, and I'm going to take that to Adil. But here's the thing, Scott. Now, of course, we cannot be complacent about it. But let me say that, this whole RDD, IND scenarios, it seems to me that they're a bit exaggerated. Now, why am I saying this? Like, you remember a 2004 paper which was commissioned by the WMD Commission, and it described at least 6 steps, and all these steps needed to go undetected for such a scenario to take place. And I'm talking about the IND, not the RDD. So you need to have a terrorist group with the necessary technical and financial resources to execute this. So you must organize and begin operations. And then, of course, the fact that the group must choose to engage in an act of nuclear terrorism at the highest levels of violence. It then must acquire sufficient fissile material to fabricate an IND, which can be through gift, purchase, theft, or diversion. And I'm just talking about the points that the WMD Commission report put out. And then you have to transport that intact IND or its components to a high-value target, and then you must be able to detonate the IND. And it seems to me that, I would like to get Adil's take also on this, that all these 6 steps going undetected, given various measures that have been taken by countries, is near impossible. But what is possible is missiles hitting nuclear plants during interstate wars.
Yeah, on the point on the non-state actor or terrorist, the steps that they need to go through, those are certainly, a significant, process. But I think if you have a sophisticated and motivated terrorist group, they can absolutely do that. As Sitara noted, there's right now the global nuclear security architecture is really a patchwork of legal instruments and multilateral bodies. So there are a lot of gaps that are out there. And again, the index does a really good job of identifying those gaps and ways to strengthen those gaps. We know that there's sufficient amount of nuclear material outside of regulatory control for very serious concern. And the thing that we're seeing in the United States in particular is that we're seeing, with domestic violent extremism, that the number of, terrorist groups that are interested in weapons of mass destruction is actually increasing. The ideologies, there's more ideologies that are considering this. So when I see all of these factors, I'm still, quite concerned that, terrorists could pull off an improvised nuclear device.
What I fear most is not so much a terrorist group pulling it off, but some ideological group, which is xenophobic or jingoistic or, fired up for whatever reason, the ideology, actually taking over a state, because then that group will have the state's resources. But if the state remains largely intact, and frankly, I remember back in 2006, 2007, there were these analyses coming out of the West about, the Taliban have reached Sawabi, and it's like a 60-minute crow flight from there to Islamabad, and what's going to happen and the rest of it. I think a lot of that, I would understand. I'm not saying that those concerns were totally, I won't dismiss them entirely, but things are much more, sophisticated at our end also. And that's where I'm going to pull in Adil. Adil, so in terms of what we have done domestically, the index gives us 100 marks. It's, as a matter of fact, India is way behind. I think it's 36 or something. In terms of what we have done, legislation and the rest of it. Give us a sort of overview of what all we have done. Which is something that can be brought on the record. I'm not asking you for any sensitive information, but things that we have done. And Scott has raised a very good point in terms of the bilateral 1989 agreement about non-attack on each other's nuclear facilities. And he's actually said that, he hopes that can be replicated elsewhere also. Anything else? We, in fact, just to add, for good measure, we, in fact, offered a number of other NRRMs to India, but India keeps pulling in China, so they haven't really materialized. But just run us through what we have managed to do so far.
Yeah, I think you raised an important point about this whole issue of terrorism, and I would relate to the previous discussion also about the reluctance by states like Pakistan to engage with this process or any other process. Because if you recall, this whole process came out of this thesis that nuclear terrorism is a reality and it's going to happen anytime soon, and most likely region is going to be this because this nuclear terrorism or terrorism was overly politicized, and that's why countries like Pakistan, they were reluctant because this was being used as a political weapon to extract concessions as elsewhere, not necessarily on the nuclear issue. Because as Sitara also mentioned, nuclear security is a national responsibility because it's in their own interest. Anything happening on their territory, it is going to affect their credibility also, and their population also, and their domestic standing also, and the international standing also. I think all states that have this nuclear material or the capabilities or the power plants, they take best possible efforts as per the IAEA guidelines. The problem starts when the military side comes in, and that's most of the states that don't share information. And if you see the index, all the nuclear weapon states, they fall on towards the tail end of the side because that information is not shareable. They don't share, and you cannot judge them where they stand on that context. So that was one of the issue, the key issue, the reluctance because at that time, in 2009, if you recall, Ejaz, this terrorism issue was being frequently used against Pakistan. And It was not about nuclear. It was about to extract concessions in a once or things like that. So NTI doesn't have to do anything to do with that politics. But once the NTI or any other entity, they start asking countries that we share information. So there is a reluctance by the decision makers also why this information is being asked from us. And this position was taken that as a matter of principle, because Nuclear Security Summit, there were plenty of other things that were going on in the Nuclear Security Summit process itself, because I was part of the Pakistani core team that was negotiating different outcome documents. There was so many initiatives that were coming out of Nuclear Security Summit process, because then it was turning into a fatigue, that there were demands from countries like Pakistan that you share more information. So I think at that time, this was, as a matter of principle, decided not to engage with the NGOs, but as state, we can continue to engage with the Nuclear Security Summit. So
but other sorry, just one sort of point. I remember, and you were there at SPD. SPD actually used to have a fairly frequent, they used to get the media and outside experts, and there used to be a fairly open discussion in terms of what Pakistan was doing, and a lot of that was also getting reported. So it's not like they were a completely closed club at that time.
Absolutely. That was again to dispel that impression that Pakistan is not doing enough in terms of nuclear security. And as you mentioned, there were foreign correspondents that were invited to the SPD. Yes. There were briefings held by DG SPD at that time, General Kadwai also. We provided as much transparency as we could. In fact, more than many other countries, that you invite local journalists also and the foreign correspondents also, and then you tell them what actions that we have taken in terms of nuclear security, and the questions that were raised by the journalists or the foreign correspondents from the military officials, those were answered. Now, briefly to recap, you said what Pakistan has done. I think the kind of situation that we were at that time. So it was decided at the leadership level that for nuclear security, for our own interest, we need to do certain measures that may entail more investment in terms of human resources, in terms of money. And the United States did help, encouraged also, and did assist also, like for setting up of this Pakistan Center for Excellence for Nuclear Security, which is an excellent facility, and it's now a regional hub for training for the IE, other centers of excellence. And then we raised this National Security Division, which was initially 20,000 or so troops.
It's a specialized force.
Absolutely.
For the security of nuclear installations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So all these measures that were being taken, and some of them were, of course, they included both the military and the civilian side. These were not to get any ratings, positive ratings from the outside. This was because the realization was there, and the Nuclear Security Summit did help in raising that awareness at the public level amongst the governments also. Because one thing that was positive or that was good about Nuclear Security Summit process was that this was at the leadership level. And it was more inclusive and participatory, where the national leaders from over 50 countries, President Obama himself leading that initiative. So that provided a kind of a comfort amongst the political leadership that, yes, this is a national issue, but as a collective responsibility, we need to take those actions which can give confidence to the international community. So as part of that understanding at the senior leadership level, I think that all the countries, including Pakistan, they took measures which in a way strengthened nuclear security in the respective countries. Then IE also provided that kind of a boost or support to the IAEA initiatives also, because there were certain conventions, there was lack of awareness about those conventions or the guideline documents. Once this debate started, the political momentum started, then it became easier for the countries or the the military establishments or nuclear establishments in all the countries to encourage the respective institutions to do more about it. And I think that is how all countries have helped improve nuclear security in their respective countries, and globally we saw positive dividends. And this NTI Index, like I said earlier, I saw a very interesting thing. It also, in a way, very politely suggests to the countries, if you want to get more numbers, more marks, so it provides that incentive that if you adhere to this convention or you strengthen or take certain measures, maybe you will get 3 marks, maybe 5 marks. I think that's the way to do, because without pointing fingers towards the countries, without becoming intrusive, you're just showing the path to countries.
I think marks are there and they're great, but NTI should also promise sweet treats for anyone whose rating goes up. But Sitara, we've talked about Pakistan a fair bit, but let's talk about global trends, because the NTI Index also talks about global trends, and it notes that in many ways those trends are not particularly promising. Now, we know that the bilateral architecture, treaty architecture between the US and the Russian Federation and the former Soviet Union is basically unraveled. Verification mechanisms and the rest of it. I remember going to Sandia back in '99, and there was like these fabulous mechanisms, verification mechanisms, and the rest of it, and we were given briefings also, but a lot of that has unraveled. Then, of course, the fact that interstate war is back, the fact that there are emerging technologies, hypersonic missiles, for instance, in the case of India and Pakistan, if you introduce artificial intelligence into the kill chain, and there are hypersonic missiles, you may have nothing more than maybe a few seconds to decide how to respond. So you can either fail deadly or you can fail impotent. And then, of course, you have the non-nuclear strategic weapons delivery systems and the rest of it. So when this report was being done, were these issues that were discussed? Are these issues that should be of concern, that not just one particular country, but globally, that countries, including nuclear weapon states, should be particularly concerned about these developments?
Yes, I think this is something nuclear security experts all over the world are looking at with concern, because, and this bothers everyone precisely because if you look at how traditionally nuclear security has been looked at, if we are talking about a power plant security, there used to be a design basis threat, which identify what threats comes to a particular facility or a power plant or any entity that is being secured. And within that, countries had not taken into consideration military strikes, because that was something previously considered beyond design basis threat, and that was something states' responsibility. But now, after Zaporizhzhia, after Ukrainian war, that has something which has become a prime concern of nuclear security, because if something of that nature happens, this actually falls in the ambit. It's no more an armed conflict, but it's very much concerned with nuclear security. So there are changing trends. As you rightly pointed out, at one hand, the global non-proliferation or the cooperation in whatever form and shape it existed is in a state of disarray already. And the nuclear security, which was slowly and steadily evolving, and was slowly and steadily coming at a point where countries were not getting into more agreements, but at least agreeing and understanding, okay, this is what needs to be done. So if focus shifts on other issues, this is something definitely is going to be affected. So that's very much concern everywhere. And with the coming of emerging technologies and involvement of emerging technologies, where the threat has become complicated even more. So from the perspective of IAEA, where nuclear security the global norms and global actions are being agreed or discussed. I think at the IAEA forum as well, now the nuclear security, the review process of the International Convention of Physical Protection, that has become a good forum where these concerns are being discussed. And also biannual nuclear security conferences where such things are being discussed in a great detail. But as I mentioned earlier, that states are taking care of nuclear security because it definitely is there in their own national interest, and they want it to be as such. But there are new measures which IAEA is also encouraging, and reports like NTI and other discussion papers on nuclear security globally are encouraging as well. So I think when we talk about how future will look like, I think there is need to reinforce the existing agreements that are there, and side by side there is need to bring out the need to increase these risk, the issues concerning the nuclear security. There is need to focus on that, because if something happens, the country itself is which is being affected more. And I think since I've been working in nuclear security for some time, I think the second worst thing for any nuclear security debate would be to overestimate it. But the first, the primary worst thing could be underestimating it. So there has to be a fine balance as to, not to just exaggerate the threat, but as well as not to underestimate it, because there has to be, the threat exists. If it hasn't happened, does not guarantee that it would not happen. The probability might be very low, but the consequences can be way too high. And that is why there is a constant need to, continue to not only focus on that, but learn from the best practices, but also evolve the security practices along with, as well as the threat is evolving. So it has to be,
Right.
a constant effort which will ensure that countries are staying ahead of potential perpetrators.
No, absolutely. I mean, call it apt or call it a bit ironic, but this iteration, NTI sixth iteration, almost synchronized with Oppenheimer being premiered across the world. And, those famous words, "I'm become death, destroyer of worlds." But since I am now getting to the last segment of the program also, Scott, we know that, it's unless we actually develop something. I mean, lots of prototypes are developed, but they're not really commercially used or militarily used. But once you have those things, then of course you need some kind of legal framework. And then out of that legal framework, you also develop a certain kind of coercive normative framework, which is what the NPT is with reference to nuclear weapons. But we already know that in terms of dual technologies, the Wassenaar arrangement is, I mean, even the best technical minds can just go bonkers just trying to figure out how to sort of work out these things. And there's so many emerging technologies for which we don't really have any legal framework right now. And so that's a big problem. Then there is the problem of non-cooperation or lack of cooperation, or some kind of reluctance as far as non-proliferation is concerned. We also now have not so veiled threat of actual use of tactical nuclear weapons. Some of those have been shifted to Belarus. So that's another danger. And I think if, heaven forbid, if it were to come to pass, it would be a huge rupture of that, taboo, call it taboo, or the norm, or whatever. So we are entering into a very uncertain world. And so before I close the program, I would like you to give our viewers a sense of what we are getting into.
Yeah, it's certainly, from my perspective, perhaps the most dangerous moment that we faced in the world since the fall of the Soviet Union. And as you noted, I'm particularly concerned about the unraveling of the arms control agreements between the United States and Russia. This was an area that we were able to work together on, back in the 80s, even when there was a lot of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. But those, one by one, seem to be falling away. In addition, you've got China, which is, very likely increasing its overall nuclear weapons stockpile. So, as you think about arms control going forward, you really need to think about it from not just a bilateral standpoint between the United States and Russia, but from a trilateral standpoint to also include China. And the developments of what are happening in China, there certainly will be echoes and repercussions across South Asia. India might feel the need to increase its stockpiles, and then what happens in Pakistan if that happens. And so it's a really concerning moment. The NPT, we didn't get a consensus document at the last review, but there still was some positive discussions that were happening there. And I think it's really important for all countries to really demonstrate that we can make progress on disarmament. And I'd note that there's one particular area of interest. It's the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. This is a group of 31 countries, including 3 weapon states, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, that are actually working together to identify the process by which all countries could verify arms reduction agreement, which is really important work to do just from a kind of a nuts and bolts, here's how we would do it standpoint, but also it demonstrates that there is a role for every country to play in reducing stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And we really need to build on this effort and do more in this area to reinforce the NPT and to reduce the tensions that we're seeing today.
Right. As a matter of fact, the Indians have already put trial balloons, not one, but more than one Indian analyst, about how is the world going to react if India were to go for a thermonuclear test. And so we have been obviously following these statements very carefully, and because we are also looking at certain other developments. But here's the thing. If Australia is now going to get nuclear-powered submarines, I mean, that's an issue which obviously legal experts batting for the US and Australian and UK governments say, well, it's not going to have an impact, but those who are more independent and are not batting for any government are quite clear that it kind of ruptures the norm. So that I just want to get your quick comment on that.
Yeah, certainly. As we talk about quantities of highly enriched uranium, the fact that there'll be metric tons of highly enriched uranium sent to Australia as part of the AUKUS deal is of concern. Obviously, this material will be in underwater, but still, that's a significant increase in the amount of highly enriched uranium that will be out there in the globe. And yeah, the details are still a little bit murky in terms of how this will strengthen the non-proliferation regime. I know that is the intention of the agreement, but I haven't seen the details yet that really demonstrate that. It's a really great opportunity for Australia to do more in the area of non-proliferation. Additional steps or measures they could ask from the International Atomic Energy Agency to take to verify that nothing is happening on the nuclear weapons side in Australia. So I'm hopeful that there'll be something positive that comes from this, but I think it's still TBD.
Right. Very quickly, got less than a minute, Sitara. Your view on this highly enriched uranium, which will be used in the nuclear submersibles for Australia?
Yes, at one hand, there is greater effort being made that reduce the use of highly enriched uranium to where some significant developments have happened as the reduction has taken place, where for non-military use, there is focus that highly enriched uranium should not be used. But this is a different case. And I think here, the risk is not that highly enriched uranium is being used, but the implication of that submarine, nuclear submarine, and the geopolitical connotations and how it violates or does not violate, for that matter, the NPT and the other international norms. So, this really takes us back to whether the norms are important or the geopolitical considerations are important.
That's
is important.
There's always unfortunately a tension between the two. But before I close the program, again, very quickly, Adil, less than a minute, the trial balloons that I was talking about in terms of thermonuclear tests by India and the possible consequences of that.
That would be very unfortunate because then it will push this region towards both countries will engage in an arms race which has no end, and it is going to be destabilizing. Just on the Australian, if Australia wants to remain number one in the NTI Index, probably they should reconsider their decision of not acquiring nuclear-powered submarines.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is just a bird's eye view. Frankly, I mean, the report is excellent. There's so many. There are multiple findings and recommendations, and obviously, it's difficult to capture all of those in a short program. But I'm really grateful to Scott Roecker for his input. Adil Sultan, Sitara, Noor, grateful as always. Thank you to all three experts for being on the program. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.